Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating and frankly intense intersection of geography, money, and power. We are looking at how shifting demographics and tax-driven migration are triggering massive institutional battles over the actual structural mechanics of American politics. The maps we've relied on for decades are changing incredibly fast, and as we'll explore, the consequences are seriously testing the limits of our constitutional framework. So, let's start with a really big question. Is the power of your vote determined by your zip code? Right now, where Americans are choosing to live is fundamentally altering the political map. It's putting immense strain on our Constitution. We usually think of political power in terms of national elections and massive campaign ads, right? But the reality is that local geography, your specific zip code, is actually what's driving the current era of extreme political friction. To unpack exactly how this is happening, here is our agenda. We'll cover the Great Geographic Sorting, following the taxes, the Electoral college friction, the popular vote push, redrawing the battle lines, and finally, the future of federalism. Okay, Section 1, the Great Geographic Sorting. The modern urban-rural divide in this country is absolutely stark. When you map out the voting share by county, you see these incredibly dense Democratic strongholds along the coasts and right in the middle of urban centers. And they're completely surrounded by this vast sea of less densely populated but heavily Republican counties. It's a striking visual contrast. What this means in practice is that Democrats are far more heavily clustered together into population-dense areas than Republicans are. When voters pack themselves into high-density urban zones like this, it creates what political scientists call a natural electoral bottleneck in district-based representation. And this isn't just a minor blip. The research indicates that the geographic sorting of partisans we're seeing today is higher right now than at any point since the Civil War. Moving on to Section 2, following the taxes. People aren't just packing up their ideology, they are packing up their tax returns. Look at the IRS migration data from 2022 to 2023. It shows a massive exodus. High-tax states like California, New York, and Illinois are losing tens of thousands of tax filers. Meanwhile, states with no or low income taxes, places like Texas and Florida, are absorbing those exact populations. To really put the economic impact of that migration into perspective, just think about this number, $20.6 billion. That staggering figure represents the net adjusted gross income gained by the state of Florida alone in just that one single year of migration. So we aren't just seeing a shift in voters, we're witnessing a massive, historic transfer of wealth across state lines. And money isn't the only thing moving, because political representation in the U.S. is tied directly to population. This tax-driven migration has massive political consequences. Deep blue states like California and New York are actively bleeding future electoral college votes and congressional seats. At the same time, red states like Texas and Florida are projected to gain those exact seats by the 2030 census. Which brings us to Section 3, the Electoral college friction. When crafting the rules of the game, the framers of the Constitution deliberately rejected a direct popular election. Our source material highlights that they explicitly wanted a manifestly non-majoritarian process. That means they intentionally designed a system that wasn't just simple majority rules. The goal was to ensure smaller states maintain disproportionate political power as a core safeguard of our Federalist system. They wanted a chief executive who had to appeal to diverse state interests rather than just catering to densely packed urban populations. Now let's look at Section 4, the popular vote push. Because of this geographic sorting, we're seeing a push to bypass the traditional system. Enter the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or the NPVIC. Currently supported primarily by Democratic-led states, this compact is an agreement where member states pledge all of their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. Once states totaling 270 electoral votes join up, it activates. It would completely convert the Electoral College into a de facto direct popular election, totally bypassing the need for a constitutional amendment. Let's compare the two. Under the current system, electors reflect the unique will of their specific state's voters. But under the NPVIC, a state's electors would be forced to completely ignore the interests of their own local voters in favor of whoever secures a national plurality. It acts as an interstate loophole designed to bypass the traditional amendment process entirely. Looking back at the framers' original intent, legal scholars point to quotes from Alexander Hamilton, who explicitly warned that these provisions were adopted to prevent combinations. The founders were literally terrified of states forming voting blocs to dominate the executive branch. Analysts argue that the NPVIC embodies the exact type of long-term combination among the states that they feared would fracture the republic. The legal critiques of this maneuver are incredibly fierce. Many scholars argue the NPVIC is basically a constitutional crisis in waiting. They suggest it deliberately subverts the finely wrought electoral procedures designed to protect minority regions from majoritarian rule. By doing so, it effectively nullifies the political voice of any states that choose not to join the compact.
Section 5. Redrawing the battle lines.
The friction isn't just happening at the presidential level. States operate under vastly different legal constraints when drawing congressional maps. If you look at trifecta states, where one party controls the governor's office and both legislative chambers, you can see whether their state constitutions explicitly prohibit political gerrymandering and whether they use independent non-politician commissions to draw the maps. But here is where critics point to a pretty stark contradiction. We are observing instances where Democratic-led legislatures are actively maneuvering to override or circumvent the very independent redistricting rules they originally championed. In California and New York, for example, legislative efforts have specifically targeted bypassing their own independent commissions, all to impose new, highly partisan congressional maps right in the middle of a decade.
Let's wrap up with Section 6, the future of federalism.
Beyond elections, federalism is being tested in other ways too, like the rise of sanctuary policies. Generally enacted in Democratic-leaning jurisdictions, these are local ordinances that explicitly limit cooperation with the federal government when it comes to enforcing national immigration laws. It represents a deliberate legal effort at the subnational level to actively abandon cooperation with established federal authorities. When you look at the NPVIC, the Circumvention of Independent Redistricting Commissions, and sanctuary policies collectively, a very distinct narrative emerges in our source material. Critics cited in the research point out what they describe as a pattern of political hypocrisy. They specifically argue there are consistent instances where members of the Democratic Party selectively bypass or rewrite established structural rules the moment those rules no longer yield favorable political outcomes for them. Ultimately, what the source material reveals is that the intense geographic sorting of Americans has made the political stakes incredibly high. The structural guardrails of our Federalist system, the mechanisms meant to ensure compromise and broad representation, are being relentlessly tested, stretched, and in some cases entirely rewritten from the local level on up to secure political dominance. It leaves us with a fundamental test of our republic. Can institutions that were specifically built on compromise, designed centuries ago, survive an era defined by extreme geographic polarization and a constant willingness to circumvent the rules? It's a question that's going to define the next decade of American politics. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the maps.